Ryan Banneman has the floor.
Yeah, that would be best, unless...
Okay, so now we start the formal introduction and formal presentation, and I believe we are webcasting now. So my name is Jennifer Doe. I'm a faculty member here in the School of Urban Studies and Planning, and along with my colleagues Chris Monsieur and Rob Bertini, we help co-organize this weekly seminar. And we are particularly pleased, well, before I do the introduction, I do want to remind everyone that we do webcast these seminars. And so that the people watching out in Webland, and people do watch, so that they can hear your questions when you do ask questions at the end of the seminar. If you could use the microphone, hopefully there's one in front of most of you. You need to hold the touch button area and keep the red light lit as you're asking the question so people can hear the question who are watching on the web, either live or archived. And I encourage you to check the seminar website. We have over 100 past seminars that are archived there, that some very good speakers and topics. And there are seats towards the front and in, so come on up. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker. And today's speaker is coming to us as part of the ODOT Visiting Scholars Program. The Oregon Department of Transportation has provided us with to bring in scholars from beyond the Portland area. And we are very happy today to have with us Jonathan Levine from University of Michigan. Jonathan is an associate professor and chair of the Urban and Regional Planning Program at University of Michigan, a very excellent program, and we have a few of the grads here. Mark Schlossberg, our colleague at University of Oregon, helped arrange for him to come here, and I understand you were at U of O earlier in the week, speaking there as well, so we're very happy to have this collaboration between the campuses and with ODOT as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan, and I do hold substantive questions until the end, and we will have time for discussion at the end. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer. And thanks very much to Mark for arranging this, to Rob for arranging the local hosting, and I'm very much enjoying spending the last few days in beautiful Oregon. It's been a great change. I just finished my semester at Michigan, and it's been a wonderful break. I want to start by taking you on a visit to the suburbs of anywhere. It's not really the suburbs of anywhere. It's a real place. It's Fruit Heights, Utah. Fruit Heights is a northern suburb of Salt Lake City. A newly developing neighborhood in Fruit Heights. In fact, so new that 3 of my pictures are just architect's plans. Only one is a demo house. If you were to find yourself walking or driving around this neighborhood, what would you think about it? Now, in all likelihood, you would think very little because of its very ordinariness. You'd probably say, I've seen 100 like this. If you were to think something about it, your attitude would probably stem from your core beliefs or commitments on issues of land use, metropolitan form, sprawl, and markets. Let me give you a sketch of what you might think, depending on who you are. If you see yourself as an advocate of compact development, walkable, smart growth, transit-friendly development, cycle-friendly development, you might look at this neighborhood and you might say, the markets tend to produce a whole lot of sprawl. What we need is governmental intervention to mitigate this sprawl, to generate more alternatives to this sprawl. And by the way, could I ask for a cup of water? Somebody would be... Thank you. Appreciate that. If you fancied yourself more of a free marketeer, somebody who's not inclined towards governmental intervention, you might look at this neighborhood and you might say, this neighborhood seems like it's more or less the market at work. People prefer large houses, people prefer large lots, people prefer an auto-oriented lifestyle. Here's the market producing what people want. So sounds like not too much of a problem. And what both observers agree upon, both the compact development-oriented observer and the free market-oriented observer seem to agree upon, is this is a product of markets, free markets, and where they differ is whether or not there ought to be greater governmental intervention to control and constrain those markets and to start generating alternatives. It's where those two observers agree that I want to disagree. I want to ask you for the next 40 minutes or so to look at this question differently from how both of those observers will tend to identify the problem. In order to do so, I want to show you a picture of what you're not going to see in Fruit Heights, Utah. What you're not going to see in Fruit Heights, Utah is a development on the very same site that was proposed by a different developer, and the development was zoned out, hence the title of my book. The book is not about Fruit Heights. It's about thank you very much, Jennifer. It's about a nationwide phenomenon, but Fruit Heights is an example. The development was zoned out by the city of Fruit Heights, who said that we don't want attached development in our community, and we don't want attached development on this site. You can't build it here. We're not going to reform the low-density single-family zoning that would allow you to build this kind of development. Oh, and incidentally, this development, units in this development, are about half the cost of the single-family units that will be built on that site. So now let's think about it. Think about those two observers. Both of them said, the market seems to want to produce a lot of sprawl. One observer said that's a problem. The other observer says that's probably okay. But when we look at what the market truly wanted to produce here, I think we have to challenge our fundamental assumptions about the relationship between sprawl, land use, and markets. So my agenda for this afternoon. We urban planners frequently like to frame our debates in terms of planning versus markets. So we like to ask the question, when should planning allow market ordering to run on its own, and when should government intervene? And I want to argue that in the case of land use, metropolitan development, sprawl, compact cities, that's an exceedingly poor problem definition. And the reason why is that governmental intervention is already ubiquitous, and the governmental intervention has the effect of lowering development densities, separating land uses, accelerating metropolitan sprawl. The policy reforms that are needed are not so much intervention into free markets as reform of governmental regulation that are forcing a sprawling development pattern. One way I'd like to describe this is that the recipe for urban sprawl, the template for urban sprawl, is written right there into our land use regulations. If that's the case, asking whether or not governmental intervention into the system is or is not warranted seems to get things backwards and becomes ultimately a nonsensical question. The second issue there is very intimately related. When we view the status quo as the market, in our market system, in our American market system, and frankly in most market systems of the Western world, we create a certain default choice. We say, because we're going to view the status quo as a reflection of the market, we view it as a kind of state of nature. And we ask the question of whether or not interventions into that state of nature are justified by the science. Now, what kind of science would justify those interventions? First and foremost, travel behavior science. So we look to the science of why people travel and how they travel to ask questions of whether or not compact development would or would not lead to benefits like reduced vehicle miles traveled, or increased transit use, increased walking and physical activity associated possibly with increased health. So we look to scientific certainty, or at least scientific confidence, to justify deviation from sprawl. In that, we're setting up a burden of proof where if we don't manage to cross that threshold, that burden, presumably we revert to the default choice, which is sprawl. I want to question that formulation as well. Ultimately, what I'm talking about is a different rationale for policy reform in the land use and metropolitan development area. It's a rationale based in expansion of choice rather than a rationale based in proven scientific benefits. Whenever we set up the burden of proof that I referred to, we're trying to justify or delegitimate, either or, policy reform based on the presence or absence of scientifically proven benefits in physical activity, in VMT reduction. Ultimately, though, I think what we need to be talking about is an alternative foundation, and that is giving people the opportunity to make choices in walkable communities, in compact development, in transit-friendly areas, choices that have been historically excluded by regulation. To help us think about this, I want to propose two alternative frameworks. Well, one, I don't want to propose it. I actually want to try and identify what's out there. So this framework is the one that I'm going to be arguing against, but this is the one that I think is common in our debates about metropolitan development. So the way to read this pyramid is from the bottom. The first question we're going to ask is, what's the relationship between alternatives to sprawl and market forces? In this standard way of looking at the world, markets are incapable of providing very many alternatives to sprawl. So if you want a colloquial way of describing this, we all know within this framework what the American dream is. The American dream is a big house on a large lot, so markets tend to serve that American dream, and it's really hard to get markets to produce compact development, to produce walkable development. In that world, what are we doing when we reform transportation and land use policy? Well, we're intervening into those markets. So presumably we're intervening into those markets in order to encourage them, induce them, some might even say force them, to generate alternatives that the market isn't otherwise interested in producing. The pinnacle of this pyramid is the rationale. Why would we intervene into such markets? Well, we would intervene into those markets because we can prove the benefits of those interventions. We can show that compact development, when we induce it or even, shall we say, force it, provides benefits like reduced vehicle miles traveled or increased transit use or increased walking. Ultimately, this standard framework is a view of sprawl as a potential market failure. And I'd like to read you a quote, because this quote really captures excellently this view of sprawl as potential market failure. This is by Jan Bruckner, an economist, who writes, "Does the invisible hand, which guides the conversion of land to urban use, push too hard in the direction of bigger cities? Economists use the term market failure to describe a situation in which the invisible hand fails to allocate resources in a socially desirable manner so as to maximize aggregate economic well-being. Is a market failure involved in the spatial expansion of cities? If so, the criticism of urban sprawl is justified and measures are needed to restrict urban expansion." So, excellent statement of the standard view. But the standard view has a big problem. Think to my pictures from Fruit Heights, Utah. In Fruit Heights, Utah, we didn't have the invisible hand leading towards lower densities and hence greater expansion of the footprint of the metropolitan area. We had the very, very visible hand of municipal regulation. So if all we're searching for is the effect of the invisible hand, we're not likely to find the effect of the very visible hand of land use regulation. To help resolve these contradictions, I want to propose an alternative framework, and this is the one that I'd like to ask you to consider this afternoon. We're asking fundamentally the same questions. The bottom question, what's the relationship between the market, the free market, and alternatives to sprawl? In this framework, there is market interest in the alternatives to sprawl, but municipal regulation tends to constrain the expression of that market interest. In that world, what are we doing when we engage in policy reform? We're not intervening into markets as we were into the first one so much, although surely there is an element of intervention into markets, but fundamentally we're removing obstacles to market expression of people's preferences. If that's what we're doing, the next question is, why would we do such a thing? Proven benefits are pretty nice. We'd like it if the science were sufficiently solid that we could say, let's engage in that policy reform because we are absolutely certain that we'll get those benefits. As a practical matter, those of you who are familiar with this literature will probably acknowledge that the science is frankly ambiguous. We have some very, very complex systems that lead to travel behavior in multidimensional ways, and we have a hard time linking specific elements of land use to specific elements of travel behavior. But in this world, that doesn't matter all that much, because ultimately what we're talking about is removal of obstacles to choice. We're talking about expansion of choice. The next quote I'm going to bring you is the precise opposite of the first quote. So the first quote was the quote from Jan Bruckner advocating a potential market failure view of sprawl. And the second is from another economist, Tony Downs, who argues that the belief that sprawl is caused primarily by market failures is based on the false assumption that there is a freely operating land use market in U.S. metropolitan areas. No metropolitan area has anything remotely approaching a free land use market because of local regulations adopted for parochial, political, social, and fiscal purposes. Most suburban land use markets are dominated by local zoning and other regulations that are aimed at excluding low-income households and that distort what would occur in a truly free market. Okay, so now we have two really big competing ideas, both of which, by the way, are endorsed by different economists, and very respected economists at that. So one is, sprawl may or may not be a market failure. Let's check. If it is a market failure, let's take governmental action. The alternative view is, sprawl can't possibly be a market failure because we don't have anything approaching free markets. How are we going to resolve these two big competing ideas? Well, maybe empirical science could help. So let's think about this. What would count as empirical evidence for one idea or for another idea? Well, I would argue that the binding or non-binding character of zoning could support one or another position. Let me explain what I mean. If zoning allows development of this density or this intensity, and all the market wants to do anyway is to develop up to that density or intensity, then we would say that zoning isn't a binding constraint on development, and we're probably merely replicating what the market would produce anyway. If that's the case, then that puts us into framework number one. And if that were the case, I would have to agree with Professor Bruckner. If alternatively, zoning and other land use regulations allow this density or intensity of development, and the market in some locations would prefer a higher density or intensity of development, then we would say that zoning is in fact a binding constraint. So what do the empirical results say? This is a subject that's been studied by economists empirically for years. I won't argue that there is a consensus among economists, but in my opinion, there is a clear majority view. And the clear majority view is that zoning, in fact, lowers metropolitan densities. If it lowers metropolitan densities, it's going to accelerate metropolitan sprawl. Does that resolve the question? Seems to me that it ought to. It seems to me that that finding ought to place us squarely within the second framework. But there's a twist. in this country, in our Anglo-American culture, augmented by the discipline of economics and augmented by much of what goes on in the legal field, we've undergone a very clever redefinition. We kind of define local land use regulation as a market force. Now, this can be a very puzzling idea. How can local land use regulation be a market force? Well, I'm going to argue that it's not. Local land use regulation, I would say, is the local cousin to state regulation and to federal regulation. But we sort of view land use regulation as emanating from the property rights of landowners in a jurisdiction rather than from being delegated downward from the state government. Now, in terms of black letter law, in terms of official designation of who has rights and who has power, it's clearly the latter. So in terms of that way of looking at the powers, the regulatory powers, states delegate their regulatory powers over land use to cities who wield the police power of the state. Okay, that's the official version. We've begun to view, or actually for many years now, we've viewed land use regulation as if it's closer to the protection of property rights, in other words, more closely associated with property rights than with the police power. Let me give you an illustration of this. I'd like to bring you two illustrations. One is a more colloquial and more political, and the other is a more academic illustration. Here's the political version. This is a quote from the Washington Post. "Smart growth is inconsistent with the American dream of a big home on a 5-acre lot," said David Blyden, executive director of the Maryland Association of Counties, which opposed former Maryland Governor Glenn Dennings, the smart growth governor of Maryland, the governor's effort as an unreasonable intrusion into counties' power to regulate building. The concept of a higher authority, of a big brother, is inconsistent with the democratic principles that have to be intertwined with land use management. So, and I'd like to pause a second and parse these words. Intervention, state-level intervention into the county's power to regulate raises the specter of Big Brother and is anti-democratic. Now, but let's think about this one. Let's go back to the first line of this quote. Smart growth is inconsistent with the American dream of a big home on a 5-acre lot. Let's assume for sake of argument, that in fact is the American dream. Let's assume that it's the universal American dream. Let's assume that everybody can afford that American dream. Under those circumstances, would the counties need the power to regulate out alternatives to that American dream? Hardly. They wouldn't need the power to regulate out denser development because nobody would want to live in that denser development. So the fact that the counties are zealously guarding their right to protect the American dream ultimately amounts to protection of one particular American dream. In fact, it amounts to governmental preference for one particular American dream against competing American dreams. Now that sounds a whole lot like the specter of Big Brother that Mr. Blyden is so worried about. So what gives here? How can we have somebody protecting us from governmental intrusion in our affairs, but ultimately arguing that what we need is governmental preference for one particular version of the American dream against potential competitors? Well, I do think it actually is resolvable. Because if we view county-level land use regulations as something other than fully governmental, if we view them as an expression of the property rights of owners in those jurisdictions, then we call that a market force. And state-level action to constrain that market force now becomes state-level action, state-level intervention into markets. So this is a very elegant redefinition of what counts as markets and what counts as land use regulation in the American scene of metropolitan development. Now you might say, okay, well, all right, that's just a politician or a lobbyist. Surely we wouldn't have respectable academics arguing the same position. Well, in fact, it's a very respectable academic position. It's one that I'm going to take a lot of issue with, but it's a highly respected position. Let me read Professor Bruckner again. A household's ability to select a place of residence from among a host of fully autonomous jurisdictions offering different amounts of public spending is tantamount to freedom of choice in the public sector. So those of you who are students of urban planning and of public policy will recognize this as a restatement of the Tibu model. So what did Tibu argue? Tibu faced the problem back in the 1950s that we didn't have any good way for people to reveal their preferences for the kinds of goods and services that the public sector would provide. Private goods and services, no problem. Market feedback, prices, the potential of businesses to succeed or fail. We had automatic feedback on the kind and quantity of private goods that people wanted. But public goods were a problem. Tibu's seminal paper in 1956 argued that, well, it turns out that we really do have a public sector way of people revealing their preferences for the kind of things that the public provides, and that is when we have multiple competing jurisdictions. The classic formulation is we vote with our feet. We choose the community that matches our needs and preferences, both for services on the one hand and taxes on the other. We choose those bundles that we prefer, and that choice is akin to a shopping trip. So now we have the bridge between a pure free market and a kind of a market in publicly provided goods. And in planning circles and in policy circles, we frequently refer to that Tibu world, the world of multiple competing jurisdictions, as this quasi-market in publicly provided goods. What's much less referred to is that quasi-market rests on a foundation of very interventionist regulation by governments. That supposed market of competing jurisdiction rests on a foundation of exclusionary zoning. Now, this is not my critique of the Tibu model. This is right there in the Tibu model. Let me read you a quote from Hamilton, writing within the Tibu model, and I would have to say that this is very much an accepted part of the Tibu model at this point. Each community is authorized to enact a zoning ordinance which says no household may reside in this community unless it consumes at least some minimum of housing. Now, I hope that some of you are scratching your heads at this point, because usually economists argue for less regulation. And here's an economist, and I should say mainstream economics in this area, saying really what we need is the ability to zone in an exclusionary fashion to make sure that people consume enough housing. Very different from economics in its national incarnation and in its state incarnation. Something happens when we get to the local level. Now, why would we argue? Why would economists argue for that position? Because in the absence of exclusionary zoning, we would risk a game, this is again Hamilton, of musical suburbs, with the poor following the rich in a never-ending quest for a tax base. So how would this work? If I'm a moderate income person, I'm trying to choose a place where to live. and I see an affluent municipality, I say, well, that would be a very fine place for me to live. They've got low tax rates. After all, they don't need very high tax rates in order to generate a whole lot of income. And so if I live there in the modest housing that I would consume, I would pay very low taxes indeed, but I would get great services. So that becomes a really great choice for me. And if it's just me who locates there, probably not a problem. But I'm going to locate there, and my friends are going to locate there. Under this scenario, after some point, we become a significant element of the population, and maybe at some point we become a majority of the population. At some point, the wealthy residents start saying, oh, this doesn't look like the place for us. They're going to start raising taxes on us, and we're not going to have our affluent, low-tax, high-service municipality anymore. Let's move to somewhere else. So that's Hamilton's fear of a game of musical suburbs, with the poor following the rich in a never-ending quest for a tax base. The solution that Hamilton, and via Hamilton the Tibu model offers, is a solution based in exclusionary zoning. That's what supposedly gives us stability. If the affluent municipality enacts regulations that precludes the development of housing that I can afford, then we have stability, and we don't have this constant disequilibrium of the rich running away from the poor and the poor trying to locate close to the rich. But here's the problem. Whenever you engage in exclusion, by definition, you're imposing costs of exclusion. So if I've been excluded from what otherwise would be my top choice of residential community, surely there are costs that have been imposed upon me. Let me give you one notable cost that would be imposed upon me. If I wanted to live in that town over there, and I wanted to live there because I work there, or maybe I work near there, and that town enacts an exclusionary zoning ordinance that says you can't live here because you're not going to be consuming enough housing here. As a consequence, I move here. Now I have the costs of travel of commuting to my work location. Well, actually, to be more specific, either I have the costs of commuting to my work location, or what's even worse, I have the costs of inaccessibility. Maybe I don't take that trip because it's too costly or too onerous, or possibly maybe I don't drive, and then the costs are even greater. No matter what, costs have been imposed on me. Now, economists have no problem dealing with costs. Economists like to look at costs, and they like to look at benefits, and they like to devise interventions, or they like to devise solutions, or they like to devise policy reforms that lead to greater benefits than costs. So surely this classic Tibu model that has taken so much hold in the policy world would have already taken those costs into account, right? Wrong. Those costs were never taken into account in the Tibu model. Instead, the costs were assumed away. And this is the perniciousness of accepting this Tibu model as gospel, as we do in many policy circles in the United States. Again, this is not my criticism of the Tibu model. This is right in the seminal article. Let me read you the words of Professor Tibu himself, 1956. Restrictions due to employment opportunities are not considered. It may be assumed that all persons are living on dividend income. I'd like to live in that world, but we don't. But I want to ask the question, why was that such a key assumption for Professor Tibu to make? First of all, all credit to him for being totally upfront with his assumptions. Shame on us for buying the model while ignoring those assumptions. Why is that assumption? Why did he need to make that assumption? Because if we assume that people actually have to get to work, then we would focus on the costs of exclusion. And we would have to we would have to balance the costs of exclusion against the purported benefits of decentralized provision of publicly supplied goods and services. Since he had no way of estimating the cost of exclusion and seeing whether they were or were not greater than the purported benefits of decentralized provision, he assumed away the cost of exclusion. So let's take stock of where we are. I've suggested two models, two ways of looking at the metropolitan development world. The framework number one is the model that I think that the current debate is stuck within. Framework number two is the alternative model that I wanted to propose, that I'd like to propose. On the one hand, if we find empirically that zoning lowers densities, separates land uses, accelerates metropolitan sprawl, that would seem to put us squarely in framework number two. But there is a catch. Well, it's actually not a catch. It's kind of a wormhole between the two frameworks. If we view municipal regulation as a kind of a market force, something other than fully governmental intervention into the economies, then we can hold in our heads two apparently contrasting, conflicting thoughts. Thought number one, zoning lowers densities and accelerates metropolitan sprawl. Thought number two, policy reform is intervention into markets. How can we keep those two thoughts in our head at the same time? If we view local zoning as a kind of a market force, then we can imagine that we dwell in framework number one, notwithstanding the fact that zoning lowers densities and accelerates sprawl. If I were an advocate of the status quo, if I thought that the current system of sprawl and suburban development were a pretty good idea, I would be very happy to use that wormhole between these two frameworks. I would be very happy because that would establish the status quo as the market solution, as the default choice. What if I were an advocate of alternatives? If I were primarily interested in alternatives to the sprawling status quo? By accepting that clever redefinition, I've accepted terms of the debate that are the worst possible terms of the debate for me, because they give all the benefit of the doubt to the status quo, and they say, well, if you can prove that your ideas about compact development and walkable development are better than the status quo, then we could go for them. But if you have uncertainty, then we're going to have to default to the status quo. In other words, for those of us who see ourselves as advocates for alternatives, we ought not and need not accept that redefinition. Here's the problem, though. My colleagues around the country who are busy testing the effect of land use on travel behavior implicitly have located themselves within framework number one. At the top of the pyramid there, they're assessing whether or not the proven benefits justify the intervention into markets. A question that only makes sense within framework number one. If you think that framework number two addresses the world better, then we're spinning our wheels and asking questions that might be interesting laboratory questions, but questions on which policy reform doesn't really hinge. Just to reiterate, I'd like to do a little device of assuming the worst case for those of us who are interested in policy reform. So the worst case is the benefits of smart growth are ambiguous, absent or ambiguous. Now let's take that finding and run that finding through framework number one. If we take that finding and run it through framework number one, what would our policy conclusion be? We ought to refrain from intervention into markets. We never actually proved that sprawl is a market failure. We never actually proved that compact development is an antidote to that market failure. Hence, we can't justify our intervention into markets. By contrast, if we start from the same assumption, the toughest assumption for those of us who are interested in policy reform, and run it through framework number two, what do we get? We say, well, okay, well, that's interesting that we can't prove that there are benefits. But still, we've got regulatory obstacles to people getting what they want in a land use and transportation environment, and policy reform ought vigorously to remove those regulatory obstacles. I'd like to offer you a few pieces of evidence before I close. This was a research project we did a few years ago, and it's a very simple project. We did a national survey of developers, a random sample of developers from the Urban Land Institute database. And we asked them, among other things, a very simple question. If we were to loosen land use regulations, how would that affect your product? And we sorted out the answers by the location of development, whether center city, inner suburb, outer suburb, or rural. This graph shows the proportion of developers that indicate that loosening of land use regulations would lead them to a denser product. So first I'd like to focus you on the all respondents line. That's the blue line with the diamonds. And I'd like to focus on the shape of that line. So in the rural areas, we have relatively few developers. Only a little over 30% of them say, yeah, we actually would develop more densely. So there seems to be little interest in developing more densely than regulations allow in rural areas. In urban area, in the center cities, there is considerably more, something approaching 70%. But this function reaches its peak in the close-in suburbs. Here's my interpretation of the shape of this function. It's kind of a tension between what developers want to do and what the municipalities will allow them to do. In the center city, in the rural areas, developers aren't really interested in developing densely, and regulations don't particularly allow or encourage dense development, so there's actually little tension. In the center city, developers tend to be interested in developing densely, but central cities tend to be relatively tolerant of dense development. So there's a little bit less of that tension. The tension reaches its peak in the close-in suburban areas, probably in the higher employment suburban areas, the hot jurisdictions that are high accessibility, where a lot of people want to be. I find it also interesting that pattern that I just described is replicated in virtually every region of the country. So these are developers who didn't coordinate their answers one with another, but nearly the same pattern of a function that maximizes it in the inner suburbs was replicated. I'd also like to point out just the sheer numbers, that even in the region that seems to be the least interested in development greater than regulations allow, and that's the south central region, that's the brown line at the bottom, nonetheless, even there, 70% of the developers said, yeah, we would develop more densely in the inner suburbs. So again, I'd like to just bring us back to some original problem definitions that we talked about the relationship between sprawl and markets. There's conventional wisdom that markets want to sprawl and planning tries to induce compact development seems to be contradicted by this kind of evidence. That evidence is based on suppliers. It's the supply side of metropolitan development. And I'd like to talk for a sec about the demand side for metropolitan development. This was a study I did in Metro Atlanta and Metro Boston. Atlanta was chosen as an area, as a region that's a good example of U.S. sprawl. And Boston was chosen as a region that developed in a very different pattern, not necessarily because of superior planning practices, but because it developed in a pre-auto era, or much of the Boston area developed in a pre-auto era. I studied both households and neighborhoods in Boston and Atlanta. And this is a question about the fit between households and neighborhoods in those two regions. On the horizontal axis, I've categorized households according to their preferences. On the left-hand side are households that have strong preferences for transit and pedestrian-oriented neighborhoods. On the right-hand side are households that have strong preferences for auto-oriented neighborhoods. That's the horizontal axis. The vertical axis is the proportion of people who live in transit and pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods. So let me do some interpretation of this graph for you. The pink line is Boston. The blue line is Atlanta. If you look at the far left of the graph, number 1, what that means is that's the top decile in both Boston and Atlanta of people with strong preferences for transit and pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods. In other words, those are the people in the combination of the two metropolitan areas that have preferences for transit and pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods that are stronger than 90% of the population. Okay, these are the walking nuts, the transit nuts, the bicycling nuts, and if you match that description in Metro Boston with its relatively rich supply of compact neighborhoods and walkable neighborhoods, you've got about an 83% chance of actually living in one of those neighborhoods. How about if you have those identical preferences in Metro Atlanta? In Metro Atlanta, you have a less than 50% chance of actually living in one of those neighborhoods. So we're not talking about people who have weaker preferences for transit and pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods because they live in Atlanta. I actually categorize the people without reference to where they live. I pooled the sample and categorized people's preferences. So we have the very same transit and pedestrian nuts in Boston and Atlanta, but if you live in Atlanta, unless you're wealthy, you're out of luck, because land use regulations make those kind of neighborhoods very, very scarce. Here's a slide that I've been happy to use in other states around the country, and I'm especially happy to use this slide here in Oregon. Your Oregon Transportation Planning Rule is an almost perfect illustration of the points that I've been trying to make about how we view local regulation. Let me read you some of the key language of the Oregon Transportation Planning Rule. Local governments shall adopt land use and subdivision regulations to reduce reliance on the automobile, which allow transit-oriented developments on lands along transit routes. Now, how is this regulation viewed by most observers? Most observers would say this is state-level intervention, and it's state-level intervention into economic activity. Now, if you like that state-level intervention, you might say, oh, and by the way, that state-level intervention is warranted by the proven benefits of transit-oriented development. If you don't like that state-level intervention, you would say that state-level intervention is not warranted because the benefits of transit-oriented development are too ambiguous. But wait a second. Let's take a closer look at the language here. Is the state of Oregon requiring local governments to require transit-oriented developments? No. The state of Oregon is requiring local governments to allow transit-oriented developments. In other words, the state of Oregon is telling local governments that where there's a market for transit-oriented developments, they can't prevent that from happening. In other words, we, the state of Oregon, have given you, the municipalities, or kind of lent you, the right to regulate land. And by the way, here's a little limitation in that present that we gave you. You can regulate land in certain ways. Here's one of the things you can't do with your regulations. You can't keep out transit-oriented development on lands along transit routes. So ultimately, if we view local regulation as regulation, then we would have to acknowledge that this state law is not state intervention into the economy with all the default presumptions that would trigger. This law is actually a market-enabling statute because it's a law that prevents local governments from preventing the market from providing transit-oriented development. So ultimately, the debate is not one about planning versus markets, because we don't even agree about what constitutes governmental regulation and what constitutes markets. The debate really amounts to a debate about what does and what does not count as a market. It's so important in our market system of public life, our market system of ordering, because markets are the default choice. Government is thought to be the exception. If a solution gets crowned as the market solution, then immediately it gets the benefit of the doubt. It has the status of the default. I'd like to close with something with a little bit more visual appeal. This slide is from the city of Salonika, Greece. Salonika is the second largest city of Greece, and in my estimation, quite a smart growth town. Salonika is a very compactly developed town. It's a town where transit's mode share is very high. It's a town where 50% of the trips occur by foot, with a twist, though, because the transportation folks of Salonika, in all their wisdom, don't count trips of less than 10 minutes. So trips of less than walking trips of less than 10 minutes aren't even counted. So clearly, walking is even more than 50% of the trips in Salonika, Greece. So the question I'd like to ask is, how does a smart growth town become a smart growth town? Well, a little history here. In the 1920s, there was what was then called an exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey. We now might call it ethnic cleansing. The Turkish Muslims living in Greece were expelled and had to return to Turkey. The Greek Christians living in Turkey were expelled and had to go to Greece. So Thessaloniki, Salonika, experienced a rapid influx of population. In order to accommodate that population, a number of the small bungalows that you see in the right-hand side of the picture were put up rather quickly. These bungalows, needless to say, as the decades wore on, began to deteriorate. This happens to be a very well-preserved example of one of those small bungalows. As they deteriorated, they were replaced. Now, in the process, Salonika was becoming a bigger place, was becoming a real city, and they were replaced with buildings of increasing heights. The reason why I bring this particular slide is you can actually see the step function. If you go starting from the right to the left, you can see one of the older bungalows, a slightly higher building that replaced the bungalows in one era, and a taller, yet taller apartment building that replaced the bungalows in a later era. Throughout the decades, Salonika was increasing the permissible density so that it might be able to accommodate this growth of population. Now, this process, which, by the way, I could have used any traditional city in the world. So there's nothing particularly special about Salonika, even though it's a place that I am fond of. I got to thinking about this process and what would happen if the little bungalows, such as the one that you see on the right, were protected by a U.S.-style R1 single-family zone. Well, as they deteriorated, they could get replaced, and they surely would have been replaced by other single-family homes. Now, those homes might have been bigger. Those homes might have filled up their lots even more, although it doesn't look like there's a whole lot more room on that lot. Could have been taller, but they wouldn't have been other than single-family homes. If that had happened, of course, Salonika would have adopted a much more sprawling profile than it did. So the process by which a low-density, village-type settlement becomes a dense, modern, smart growth city is a process that requires the evolution from lower densities to higher densities, from single-family to multifamily, or a process that at least needs to allow for that. Now, I'd like to bring contrast. This second slide is from Sunnyvale, California. I bring this example because Sunnyvale is at the heart of the Silicon Valley, and one can't imagine a U.S. area that underwent a more fundamental transition than the Silicon Valley. This neighborhood was built in the 1960s, before the term Silicon Valley was even coined. It was built really as the far fringes, the far suburban fringes of the San Francisco area. In that era, the low density, I shouldn't say low density, medium density, but the modest California ranches and split levels probably made a whole lot of sense for a particular kind of development at a particular kind of place in a particular kind of era. In the meantime, this region underwent the fundamental transition to becoming the global center of high-tech manufacturing. One could literally walk to Apple Computer from this neighborhood. Not that you would necessarily want to, because you can imagine that the arterials aren't exactly the most pedestrian-friendly, but the location clearly is a very, very high accessibility location. So what happened throughout that transition? Well, nothing. And nothing is likely to happen in this neighborhood for the foreseeable future. I'll stick out my neck and say for the next few decades. I don't know what's going to happen beyond that, because this neighborhood is protected by an R1 zone. Any developer who would seek to introduce a more dense kind of development in this neighborhood in response to the high accessibility would surely get furious opposition by the neighbors, and there's little doubt that the Sunnyvale City Council would side with the neighbors. So I see in this picture the missing people. There is potential for much greater development in this neighborhood than we see, but the households that aren't there, where did they disappear? Well, of course not. They've gone to the California Central Valley, and they're commuting into their jobs in the high-tech Silicon Valley 70-plus miles each way. That's our American way of land use planning, and the perversion is we call that the market. I should bring a couple of statistics. The houses on this block are certainly million-dollar houses, very modest houses, but in that region, it's not surprising the cost. But I would also like to point out that, as near as I can tell, they're roughly $200,000 worth of structure on $800,000 worth of land. Now, my developer friends tell me that's a recipe for redevelopment. Whenever you have such expensive land and such modest structures, we developers would like to come in, knock down the old structures, and put up something new. Maybe $3 million worth of building on an $800,000 piece of land. But our R1 single-family zoning is not going to allow that. And Salonika will not be able to respond in an evolutionary fashion as Thessaloniki did. To wrap it up, I've hit quite hard on the issue of planning versus the market. I want to reiterate that we're stuck within this problem definition. We assume that whatever we have now is kind of the market system. Policy reforms are planning interventions, and I hope that I've at least given you some reason to look at the situation otherwise. My colleagues around the country who are doing their best to figure out whether compact development causes people to drive less and walk more or not, I'm very happy for their efforts, but I don't think that policy reform hinges on the results of their efforts. One way to think about this is, let's assume that the numbers turn out as bad as possible for those of us who would like to see policy reform. I think we would say, anyway, we would want to remove obstacles to people getting what they want in a land use and transportation environment. So ultimately, I think what we're talking about is an alternative foundation for policy reform, one that's based in expansion of choice rather than in proven scientific benefit. Thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
And I'll remind people to use the microphones when you ask questions.
Yes, please.
Well, by way of an ironic sidebar, there's actually a wing of the Oregon Transportation Commission trying to remove the auto-reliance language from the Transportation Planning Rule because it's overly interventionist. But that's not my question. My question is, I'm trying to sanity check this against our experience here in Portland, and I think about the highest property values on a per square foot basis right now, and they're in our EX zones. There are mixed use, high density zones.
And that's per square foot of floor area or per square foot of land or both?
Floor area.
Floor area.
But I don't know the land numbers, but I suspect they're pretty high as well. So that maps well onto this perspective. But I also recognize that for many of those, they're also very high in amenities. So, for example, the property values are very high near where we put in a streetcar. So an amenity is also an intervention, and how do the amenity interventions play into and interact with the reduction of obstacles?
In a positive reinforcing fashion. I mean, I do, when I talk in other areas around the country, I do hold up Portland as a positive example. I think that what you've done here in Portland is, well, I'd like to back up. The world knows what you've done here in Portland, certainly the planning and policy world. It tends to focus on the urban growth boundary, but that's only a part of what you've done here in Portland. And in my opinion, much more important than the urban growth boundary are the policies to remove obstacles to density in already developed in areas within the urban growth boundary. To the extent that if the urban growth boundary is currently under threat because of Measure 37, I'm going to venture another prediction, that even if the urban growth boundary is fundamentally eroded and is eliminated, that we wouldn't see densities of new development fall inside the future former urban growth boundary. And that's because the essence of the policy reform has been policies to overcome municipal tendencies towards lower density development. Yes, please.
You make the case for removing regulation, and yet, which I would agree with, but most of the smart growth is actually regulation in the opposite direction for higher density and for large public subsidies for that growth. How would you view that?
Let me split those two parts. Well, actually, 3 parts: removing regulation, higher subsidies, and the third one was requiring. Okay. And the first part of your question gives me an opportunity to clarify. I'm not making a libertarian argument. I'm actually not arguing for a free-for-all in land use development. I'm not anti-regulation. What I'm against is regulation. What I'm against is the traditional war of the planning structures in the United States against market-driven density. I think that's the war that we ought to give up on. Let me illustrate that one with a little point. I have a graduate of our program, student from China, who once asked me, "You want to know why I went into planning?" And I said, "Yeah, tell me why you went into planning." He says, "I went into planning because I lived the first 10 years of my life in Taipei, Taiwan. Taipei was dense, chaotic, hellish, and unlivable." He said, "Then I lived the next 10 years of my life in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was even denser, but well-planned, well-designed, and offered a high quality of life. With that, I saw the potential for planning." So I'm not arguing against regulation. I'm arguing against the battle against density. And I think what planning ought to do is engage in those interventions, including regulations, that render density high quality. And high quality and high quality of life and equitable and environmentally friendly. Second part of your question. The second part of your question was about regulations requiring density. I'll start with the punchline. Economists will tell you that minimum density regulations are unenforceable because capital is mobile. So that's a very those of you economists in the room, you can probably tune out for the rest of the example because you understand that very compact definition of the problem. What that means is, if a municipality has zoned a particular piece of territory for minimum densities, and I'm a developer, and I have a decision to make, am I going to invest in that environment, or am I not going to invest in that environment? I look at that development opportunity with its minimum density requirements, and I look at all the other development opportunities that I have, other development opportunities in the city, in the metro region, in the state, around the country, because frankly I can invest my money in a whole lot of places. If faced with that panoply of development opportunities, I nonetheless choose to invest my money in an area that's requiring minimum density, I think I'm giving you a signal. The signal that I'm giving you is I see profit potential at that location that's at least the equal of my alternative development opportunities. Now to the question of subsidies. I'm not a fan of subsidy. So I'm not going to stand up and argue for subsidized transit-oriented development or subsidized compact development. I do think it ought to pass the market test. I would, however, like to put the subsidies into context. We subsidize a whole lot of things. We subsidize transportation. We subsidize development in many ways. We subsidize development with underpriced infrastructure. We subsidize development with tax increment financing. So I wouldn't necessarily tend to single out the subsidies that are going to transit-oriented development if I weren't also going to attack and treat the full range of subsidies that we give. So let me just reiterate. I'm not going to advocate those subsidies. I would, however, like to consider them in context. Yes, please. It's a follow-up question.
Well, just a response. You said the developers wouldn't develop it. What happens is the land prices would adjust. I mean, by following your argument, they never would have developed the low density because that was not what the market supported.
When I choose to develop something, it's because it offers profit opportunities. So if I look, developers are law-abiding citizens. So they're going to treat the land use regulations as kind of the constitution for development, or of course they'll try to get those land use regulations changed. In the absence of those changes, they'll look at the allowable densities. So I'll look at it at an area that has a maximum density limitation. Again, I'll do the same thing. I'll say, does this area offer profit opportunities with its maximum density limitation that are at least the equal of my alternative investment strategies? If I choose that, surely I'm signaling you that, yes, I viewed this as an opportunity that offered at least normal profits. That doesn't mean that I wouldn't have developed at higher densities if you had allowed me to. Yes, please.
I'm a former municipal elected official and agree with the concepts of smart growth and what you have said here this afternoon. But I would like your advice on how you deal with the schizophrenic masses, which are telling us that
I think that's your job, but anyway, okay.
Because what you've said is very up here. And the masses will tend to tune it out, to be quite honest, because they tell us they are against density and they're against sprawl. They want to be able to do whatever they can on their property, but they want the government to stop their neighbor from doing what they're going to do on their property. So I'm asking you, how do we deal with that issue?
Let's see. My friend Mark Schlossberg has been teaching me about sound bites in the last few days. So I'll be a little bit flippant and say, deal with them in sound bites. Here's a sound bite. If you're against sprawl, you've got to be for the alternatives to sprawl. You can't be against the alternatives to sprawl and believe that you're consistently adhering to your anti-sprawl position. What are the alternatives that you're advocating? Where are you advocating those alternatives? I'm not saying you're going to convince a lot of people that way. That's one line of attack. Another line of attack is I tried to build a couple of sound bites into my talk today about the American dream. I would say, you know, you have your American dream. And God bless you. You can afford your American dream. You've chosen that. Nobody's going to take that away from you. But we don't want, and we don't think that you want, your American dream to interfere with other people's American dreams. Another possible soundbite. But let me be a little bit more serious about policy reform now. And to do that, I'd like to pull up another slide. I argue that there are 3 levels of potential policy reform in this area. And I bring the 3 levels because anybody can start on the first one. The third one is a flying leap and something that is a very the toughest nut to crack in the U.S. planning scene. But we can any of us can start somewhere. The lowest level, we're not going to interfere with municipal prerogative, but we're going to engage in a process of education. And my flippant sound bites are part of that process of education. But I think it's actually more serious and more effective than that. I think that process of education is happening all the time. So there's a bit of optimism here. It happens in technology transfer from municipality to municipality. When I look down the road, I'm a householder in a particular municipality, and I look down the road to another municipality, and I see, oh, they've developed a walkable neighborhood. They've developed mixed use. It kind of looks okay. Doesn't look too bad. I don't think that would be too bad in my community either. So in fact, we have this process of education from community to community. I think another vehicle for education are people like myself, urban planners, and the evolution of the urban planning profession. Just a few weeks ago, I pulled out of my bookshelf my first urban planning textbook. I took an undergraduate urban planning class at the University of California at Berkeley in 1977, and we used Gallian and Eisner, the urban pattern from 1975. And in it, the following positions were stated as virtual fact. Land uses must be rigorously separated. Commercial should not be mixed in with residential. Higher density residential must be separated from lower density residential. In other words, we urban planners were trained on that dogma a generation ago. I think the urban planning profession has evolved. And as younger generations of planners displace people who were trained on the earlier model, I think there is some optimism for this process taking place. But it's not enough because municipalities face every incentive or have every incentive to continue in their exclusionary ways. And I do think that we need to push our policy reform farther than that. My second level of policy reform is altering the incentive structure. And I'd like to give you my favorite example on this one. My favorite example is in the San Francisco Bay Area. The Bay Area Rapid Transit District, BART, has a very interesting policy regarding BART extensions. Many municipalities around the Bay Area would like BART to come their way. They would like to be the locus of the next BART extension. BART, as a regional transit agency, does something very interesting. They check the land use plans of the municipalities. And if the land use plans of the municipalities are not supportive of transit, that lowers the municipality's priority for getting the next BART extension. So here's a regional agency that's effectively saying to the municipalities, listen, we know that you've got all the prerogative. You can regulate land however you want to regulate land. But we have some leverage too. We can either extend BART your way or not extend BART your way. And if you regulate land in a way that's not supportive of transit, the probability of you getting the next BART station has been significantly diminished. And there are financial incentives that other agencies have engaged in. Anytime you have a higher level agency, organization, with interests in compact development, they frequently have leverage points over municipalities that can change the incentive structure. But ultimately, I argue for a policy of shared land use planning authority between municipalities and higher level governments. I'm bringing coals to Newcastle here. You folks in Portland are the only people in the United States who really do this. So as to not only bring coals to Newcastle, let me illustrate what it is that I think you're doing. But I want to illustrate it with not with a Portland example, because you'll all tell me why it doesn't work that way. I want to illustrate it with a Canadian example. More in my part of the world, I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan, 1 hour from the Ontario border. The province of Ontario has a very interesting structure, municipal structure. There's a very powerful board called the Ontario Municipal Board. That board sits atop all the municipalities of Ontario and effectively checks whether or not they're adhering to their regional plans. So let me give you a scenario how this works. And this is a real life case. Particular municipality is, there's an area in that municipality that's slated for compact development by the regional plan for its area. A developer proposes dense development in that area. The municipality zones out the development. The municipality says, no, you can't build that here, or you have to build only at lower densities. The developer then brings the municipality in appeal to the Ontario Municipal Board. The Ontario Municipal Board says, this area was slated for dense development by your regional plan. You have to issue him a building permit, and if you don't, we will. This is an agency with teeth that's willing to use them. But those are the facts, and let me give you a little interpretation of the facts. Most Americans looking at that situation would say, well, there's the province of Ontario really acting in a heavy-handed fashion, intervening into markets. And I say, there's the province of Ontario overcoming local governmental regulatory obstacles so that the markets for compact development could express themselves. Please.
I'm interested in knowing your plans and what you have done to promote your choice pyramid.
My choice?
Your
Promote
choice
my
pyramid.
choice pyramid. First and foremost, we academics aren't known for our activism. We're known for what we write. That's the way of the world. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just kind of our ecological niche in the scheme of things. I happen to be active in my local community, and when proposals for compact development come to my community or come to my neighborhood, you'll see me down at the Planning Commission arguing on the side of the developer for those proposals. Now, incidentally, I'm arguing usually against 100% of my neighbors who show up. There was a colleague of mine was apparently met one of these developers at his kid's soccer game, and the developer says, "Do you know this guy Levine?" And he said, "Yeah, he's in my department." He said, "My development was about to be killed, and then this guy comes out of nowhere and saved the development." That was an overstatement of the case, but in fact there are precious few voices at the local level in my municipality that are arguing for compact development, and I do my best to be there when it does come up. Yeah, Rob.
We have a couple questions from Webland.
Excellent. Hi out there in Webland.
I should mention that someone's cell phone is on and interfering with the web stream, so if you have a phone, you may
it's not mine.
turn it off. In your example from Silicon Valley, you talked about how much the land was worth versus the actual house and how that made the area ripe for redevelopment. But you said you didn't see that happening for a few decades. I was wondering if you see that development occurring in reaction to the increased value of land or because of a shift in public attitude regarding density.
I don't see it in the foreseeable future. So when I say a few decades, I can't even think beyond a few decades. And if I can manage to think a few decades in the future, few of us can actually do that. So that was a turn of phrase to indicate I don't see it happening. So I don't see it happening notwithstanding shifts of values, notwithstanding increases in energy costs, notwithstanding increases in land costs, because I see what happens when developers propose much, much less intrusive changes into the urban fabric. I see how vociferously neighbors oppose those developments, and I see how planning commissions and city councils will tend to side on the neighbors. If we're talking about an R1 zone, this is treated by the planning institutions in our country as virtually sacrosanct. In my book, I bring data from Massachusetts because they happen to track land pretty well. And the data suggest that once you develop an R1 zone, you zone it as single family, and you build it out. We're not talking about single family zone land that's not built. So it's both zoned and built as single family neighborhood. It almost never, ever changes to anything else, notwithstanding the economic changes that happen in its vicinity. So the data from Massachusetts suggests that between 1970 and the year 2000, I think I've gotten those 2 years right, upwards of 99%, something like 99.9% or even more than that of single-family neighborhoods that were single-family in 1970 were still single-family in the year 2000. A single-family zone, like a diamond, is forever. Yes, please.
If I've understood your argument correctly, then you're really advocating shifting the power for zoning to higher levels of government to overrule the parochial interests of small cities, suburban cities. Wouldn't you also take the opposite approach of bringing zoning powers down to very local levels, where neighborhoods or neighborhood associations could reap the advantage of being able to redevelop their community as property owners? And specifically, I'm thinking of neighborhoods in Houston where zoning is a private property right, neighborhoods like Montrose and Post Oak that could redevelop the higher densities as a private action by the property owners.
Excellent question. Thank you very much. I'd like to bring up a slide to help me answer that one. There is a notion out there that Houston is a different kind of city in the United States because of its lack of formal zoning. I'm going to argue that effectively Houston has recreated zoning actually in a fashion that's even a little worse and even a little more exclusionary than in other U.S. metropolitan areas. The first reason is that I've used zoning kind of offhand as a shorthand for land use regulation. Well, zoning is not the be-all and end-all of land use regulation. Zoning is kind of it's almost the last layer of land use regulation on a substrate of subdivision regulations that dictate the size of lots that you can create, transportation standards that dictate how big the streets have to be, how big the parking lots have to be, how much parking there needs to be. All of those regulations, those non-zoning regulations, the things that come before zoning, they're all in place in Houston. So to imagine that in Houston we have a true free market in land where private controls govern land use, you have to neglect this whole base of applied regulations. But there's a deeper and more fundamental reason why I'd like to challenge the Houston model, the ostensibly private law-based Houston model. The Houston model goes as follows. A developer will develop land, put deed restrictions on the land. So as a home buyer, for example, I buy into that development, and in the process of buying into the development, I'm agreeing to the restrictions on the deeds, what I can and cannot do with my property. So far, so good. I'm willing to call that a private law alternative to zoning. But in a truly private law alternative to zoning, enforcement would also be private. So as an example, I remember a discussion with my sister in Walnut Creek, California about this, and she said, oh yeah, I have a deed restriction on my house. I said, what does the deed restriction say? She says, I'm not allowed to put a basketball hoop above the garage. Okay, good example of a deed restriction. And I asked her, what would happen if you did put a basketball hoop above the garage? She said, if one of my neighbors were irritated by it, they could take me to court, presumably small claims court, and enforce the deed restriction. The difference is that Houston proactively enforces private deed restrictions. So here we have a private transaction between one developer and one home buyer, and that transaction wields the regulatory power, the enforcement power of the municipality of Houston. If you ask me, what they've done is they've recreated zoning. Only it's worse. Why is it worse? At least in the case of zoning, we have a democratically elected city council that's enacting those regulations. So we have the power of the municipal government acting, and we have a democratically elected city council that is determining those actions. In the case of Houston, we have a private transaction that's leveraging the huge and valuable and powerful force of municipal regulation. This, and let me add, if we get away from Houston for a sec, in my book, I've reviewed a number of proposals for ostensibly private law alternatives to zoning. I have not yet seen the private law alternative to zoning that I would call a private law alternative. All of them involve the public sector in one way or another. And I have not yet seen the private law alternative to zoning that would create less exclusion than current municipal zoning. I'll give you an example. One of the early thinkers in this area is Ellickson, who was quite an opponent of zoning, writes about alternatives to zoning that are based in nuisance law. So he says, well, really we don't need proactive zoning, but one land use shouldn't impose a nuisance on another land use. And if it does, you should bring them to court and you should get enforcement. Aha, you might say, but once the factory is next to me, isn't that too late to bring them to court? Ellickson would say, oh, well, no problem, because the rational factory owner isn't going to come and locate next to you if he knows that you have the power to bring him or her to court. So, all right, there's a good argument for a private law-based form of land use regulation. So far, so good for factories. What about for denser housing forms? What Ellickson says about denser housing forms is they have a way of imposing costs that are individually insignificant but collectively very troubling to normal development, and by normal he means single-family development. He says for this kind of harm, reactive nuisance wouldn't do. What we're going to need is proactive standards to keep higher density forms from encroaching on lower density forms. Now, if proactive governmental standards to keep higher density forms away from lower density forms are different from good old-fashioned zoning, Professor Ellickson does not teach us how. And I have to say that in all the alternatives that have been proposed that I've seen, private law alternatives or even economic incentive-based alternatives to land use regulation, there's always a catch that leaves government in there and ensures that higher density development does not encroach on lower density development. Yeah,
We actually have reached and exceeded our time, so I have to cut off the formal questions. And before we thank our speaker, I do want to make an announcement that the School of Urban Studies and Planning is hosting a reception for graduate students and employers this afternoon starting at 4:30. So if any of you can join us, we would like to see you there. And I also want to thank, again, ODOT for sponsoring our Visiting Scholars program, and also our colleague Mark Schlossberg at University of Oregon for helping bring Jonathan here, and to thank our speaker today, Jonathan Levine from the University of Michigan.
Thanks very much.